I am Carl Benson, and
I'm Kallan Benson.
I recognize most of the faces at this point, but if you haven't been with us, this is our Kallan's third workshop. So we're trying to figure out what news say, and they included me, so you get the parent perspective on in this presentation. So I think I'll leave and you can correct me when I'm not giving a perspective that fits with the youth climate movement here.
Sounds wonderful for us.
But where I wanted to start was my thoughts since I've been here and the theme of justice and how that fits into the climate movement, and then tell you a little bit about how our family got into the climate movement, since that was our given task for this presentation. And what I've been reflecting on, and I think this came up a little bit in the home group the home group is I've been reflecting on what the difference between fairness and justice is, and how that defines the climate movement. So I went back and I looked up what the definition of justice was and what the definition of fairness was, and saw that fairness was basically impartiality, was lack of favoritism, and justice was, we'll tell you a little bit about my background, but I went to law school. And, justice was basically our justice system, adjustment of competing claims, assigning of awards or punishments, which really, it strikes me that that's a very us versus them thing. That justice really does have, you need two sides for justice, and in looking what's going on in the natural world, my view is that nature is fair, but nature is not just. Right? I mean, justice is a social construct, it's a human construct, and so it's been very interesting to watch the youth work on these issues without the underlying experience that the rest of us here bring to the table and deal with these issues. So I've been trying to distill down, especially with everything else that's going on that's influencing the protest movements, on where we fit in, and we've kind of reached the conclusion that what we're all working on is the minimization of exploitation, and that what the youth certainly realize is that we're mortgaging the future, that the costs of our current prosperity are being passed on to the future to be paid by our children. And that gives the youth a tremendous voice to be able to say this, and they stepped up to that role, and to a large degree suffered the consequences. And then the question becomes, if you are just coming to, if you are just trying to figure out what the world is and looking at it and coming to climate, you're not looking at the thousands of years of history that we've been working on justice and how that fits in. And we really don't have time. You can't tell teenagers that, look, we've got to solve the world's problems before we can address climate change. the problem is that the systems that we set up to be able to support 8 billion people on Earth are exploited.
And self-destructing.
So,
In many different ways.
so that, you know, that's kind of the balancing act that we're trying to figure out. That's the conversation that I'm very much looking to have, is how to have that balancing act, you know, with the urgency of how to change course on what we're doing. That is, my view is we're going to be much better off if we manage to change rather than simply let Mother Nature take its course.
You said balancing act, I didn't quite get what the two sides of the balance were.
Well, from the activist side, the balance very much is, are we a part? How do we fit into the justice movement, right? There's certainly the entire environmental justice movement, and you know what you hear is, you know, we can't solve climate change without without environmental justice. But that's a double-edged sword, right? You know, you can take that to mean, well, if we just leave it up to the scientists and the engineers and just solve climate change, then by definition, like you just said, we solve environmental justice, right? Which doesn't seem to me to be the case. You know, I do think that, you know, what we need to, it's very hard for people who are coming into this without, you know, working on this, you know, for a significant amount of time to integrate with everything that's going on. So certainly in the youth movement, what you find is, you know, every mother who wants their kid to be the face of the movement will start their own organization from scratch. And you know, there's only, you know, that, yeah, and I think that's not what, you know, that's not what Greta did in Sweden. And so I would say that really hasn't worked. So it's incumbent on those of us who have been in the, you know, in the activism world to figure out how to balance the youth's desire to jettison the existing systems and lead on their own, and thereby reinvent the wheel, and balance that with the experience of how to move forward effectively without bringing all the baggage of justice movement that's out there that will turn off all the people who think this is just another front of the culture war. So that's what we're balancing.
And we have this huge, I mean, the Earth and our society is riddled with problems that we have created. And if you try to take all those on, you just can't do it. It's impossible. So you have to find out where that balance is between focusing on your little piece and recognizing that all of these problems exist and to some extent are a part of that little piece. But still being able to do meaningful work without just being sort of inundated by all of these issues.
So that's a little introduction on where I am on climate and what I'm struggling with and trying to support the youth movement. But to tell you how we got involved in all this and what you know, what my background is, you know, I will say that I just, I look at my life and I naturally say that, I'd like to live a blessed life. And in many ways, that's a perception. I mean, if we're looking at fairness, you look at the natural variations of what happens in your life, and you either look at it as positive or negative. I just see that my life is gone very smoothly. Although, when I look at it, we lost our first child. In the last 18 months, I've been diagnosed with cancer twice. But I'm here. There's no adverse effects that long term that I'm going to have to deal with that I'm aware of. I've had access to university medical systems in Baltimore. It's all going well. And from the exploited side, there's no question that I'm born a white male in a prosperous, high cost of living area. I mean, there's no way that you can't say that I'm way up there on the net positive of how we exploit the world. So that's that's where I am. As far as getting into activism and who I am, my mother went to Quaker High School. That's where Quakerism comes from. She went to Quaker High School in Philadelphia, and it stuck. So I was raised Quaker. I mean, we were not. I'm sure I'll be going to meeting tomorrow on Easter, but we were not. We certainly didn't go all that regularly. But I was raised as a Quaker, and certainly nothing like Kallan did. And went to engineering school and law school. And was working in the big firm world in Washington, D.C. Good play game to really see what the point game was. And then we had kids. And we decided to homeschool for a number of reasons. My wife was working for the National Oceanic Administration in their Office of Education. They had science teachers coming through on their awards and telling them that this was the end of their career. They weren't going back after this because No Child Left Behind was killing their abilities.
They were implementing the science at the time.
And the Department of Education, didn't. Her view was they didn't care at all what the kids were learning as long as it was measurable.
If you could test it, that's what they wanted.
So, and my son didn't talk in public until like 7.
Yeah, I remember in our meeting at the Rise meeting, we get up and we all hold hands in a circle and go around and say our names. And that's when we welcome people and say announcements and joys. And Reese would never say his name. He would always eat every time. And I remember the first time he said his name in the meeting, there was this kind of collective. I'm not gonna make a big deal. You did it. Everyone.
So yeah, so he was tested and it was determined that Reese is severely dyslexic, and the people who were looking at there's like 3 schools in the country that can deal with it.
All of which were highly expensive, not in our area, private schools.
So that kind of drove us to homeschooling. And the Annapolis Friends meeting in Maryland, you can homeschool on your own, but people are just much less an umbrella group. And meeting in Annapolis had an umbrella group. So that got us back to Quakerism. I mean, that's how we got back involved with the movement. So we've homeschooled the entire time under the auspices of an Atlas Science meeting. My wife's degree is in marine, well, conservation biology. Mine's in architecture and engineering. And it's been a very experiential learning process for our children. And we rely very much on others and the wealth of resources in Washington, D.C. area for their education. And when they were extremely young, there was certainly a lot of environmental stuff that my wife essentially led. And when they were able to walk up and down the street with the little red wagon, they did warm composting.
We did a CSA of our neighbors.
They collect all the scraps from the worm recycler and give them back to worm tea compost. And so it was very much a active, in the real world type situations. My wife this morning, she was found reeds, and I'm like, well, go take the food. We're all in Chesapeake Bay. There's no minimum age for getting a boat license. You just take the test. You can read, go take the test. So she did, and that's around that age, International Beach Day comes, and we're at the meeting, we should do something, and they folded 1,001 cranes, paper cranes, and took them and passed them out, and went to the supermarket things, which was.
Reese was not so interested in doing that. He gave them away to some people who looked friendly to him, but we both did it. We were quite small at the time.
But so that's that's what we're doing when they were really little. But after that, I mean, we were really looking to see what they felt into and how we could support them. And this was very much part of the Quaker community there. So I mean, their models very much from the Quaker values and Quaker support. But it was very much a situation where we were modeling behavior, not necessarily leading that. But the local meeting was involved in climate activism. I mean, the group there had started as you heard yesterday from Kallan here, that they were involved with climate change, and it kind of took with Kallan. And so since then, we've basically been following what Kallan's been trying to do and trying to support her. And the interesting thing about that is we haven't been surrounded by many other parents. I mean, who we've been involved with, I mean, our grandparents are heavily involved, the Quaker community is heavily involved, which is, as she described, a whole other set of grandparents. As far as young people go, depending on, she's got her definition of young person than I do. Young people go, I mean, mostly it's the professional idea. It's the people, it's the people who are being paid to get the activists out on the steps.
Young NGOs or teenagers kind of on their own.
And well, yeah, and
typically you're either dealing with teenagers whose parents actively don't want to be involved for various reasons, whether that's because they don't support what they're doing, or because they actively want it to be their kids' thing, and they're not sure how to sort of support or get involved without being completely hands-off. or it's grandparents who don't know how to get their grandkids involved or how to talk to them about it on various levels.
Yeah, and the other group that I think was kind of involved, mainly by happenstance, is that when we were getting going on this, because of Kallan's age, happened to be around the 2016 election, which just brought in an influx of new liberal activists who had, so she certainly worked with a lot of people who were new to the activism scene, as were we. I was not, I did not come out of the activist world, and we were very much trying to figure out where we fit in and where Kallan could, how to support Kallan. But that gave, that did give Kallan a huge advantage. I mean, she could bring, it coincided also with that I wasn't sure whether I wanted to play the first game. I did get laid off about that time. The clients I was working for kept me on outside the firm, so I, to make money, but just, I had a lot more flexibility on it. I was not, clear out do part of the thing, and I could figure the priority, instead of being a lawyer, was being a parent. Parent first, lawyer second, which doesn't work very well in the big firm world. But that's what I decided to do, and that's what's led to here today is being a parent first and supporting Kallan on what she's been doing.
And
so,
because of that reason, I've been lucky enough to have both parents at home for a lot of our lives. Mom was at home for a younger period, and then dad came back, and now my mom's working, but working from the Quaker Retreat Center where we live. And not only have we had both of them at home, but we've had my grandparents either living with us or very close by across the street. With this, and we've had this this just very supportive network immediately around us, and then of course the Quakers.
well, exactly. So that's what that's kind of what's happened with me, is that as I put parenting first and working on the activism, lo and behold, my Quaker connections have kind of taken over. That's been what what we've ended up doing a lot more of. It's not when I grew up, it would have ever occurred to my family that you're meeting. We weren't going to Baltimore yearly meeting until they were asking Kallan to come speak, right? But now, we are. And to the extent that, when we've been involved with Fred Florence Center in West Virginia, which is a retreat center, they got just a gorgeous place, a wonderful place, a healing place, but it's very small operation. It's had a caretaker for the last 20 years who has retired. We've been involved, and
It's very much waiting.
we could say we could do this without
Much.
without a ton of resources. We could take this on and stay involved in the environmental movement and Quakerism, and that's where we are today. So honestly, I don't know what to say about how to reproduce this, except that certainly what we did was put parenting first, but then we're back to this less light of being, fairly far up there on the living off of others and having the resources to do it that, been able to do. So that's how we've gotten to where we are on supporting the, well, in supporting the youth movement as much as we can.
Well, and just also, it is also being a part of the community as a family, and working together as a family. I mean, it was interesting being in sort of middle school, early high school, sort of get into all of this and doing the international activism because my parents were highly involved, as you can tell, but we sort of had to learn not only to be family, but to be colleagues. That sounds very institutional, and it certainly wasn't that formulaic, but learning how to work together and then being a greater part of the community and working with that community, whether it was the Quakers or the international youth or the local youth, and carpooling and picking everyone up so we can get them into DC. It certainly wasn't the traditional path, and I don't think any of us had the intention to be non-traditional or outside of the box, whether it was when you decided to homeschool us or when I was deciding to get into the climate movement, but it just kind of happened. And it resulted in us being incredibly tight-knit and close family and having these wonderful connections within our Quaker meeting and Greater Yearly meeting and living up with friends within the center where it certainly made us more Quaker, if it makes any sense. But in some ways, Quakerism drew us to activism, and activism drew us to Quakerism. Sort of the self-repeating loop.
Okay. My understanding is that's kind of where we were. That was what we were attempting to kind of describe was our family and and the and meetings involvement. And I think Kallan covered some yesterday as well. So if there's if you'd like to know more about that, feel free to ask. I also can give you some of my insights on my view of the youth climate movement and what the struggles there are, which I don't, I think I have a different perspective than Kallan does.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Or a comment, I guess. So yesterday, I've heard from Lisa, who told a little bit about her background, her story, and some support. And Claire did Quaker Voluntary Services, but I didn't hear about Claire's journey of how you, Claire, came to be where you are in your activism. What kind of support you got along the way? What, can I put you on the spot and ask you that?
Sure, if it's helpful. Sure. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Claire. I led a workshop yesterday on behalf of QBS, and I work for QBS. And am an alum of the program. I grew up Quaker, and sort of turned to Quaker Voluntary Service as a service program after graduating from college. I don't know what other.
So that came from your family growing up in that Quaker tradition, if you will.
Yeah, and just looking for an immersive experience grounded in Quakerism. Where do you all see yourself going as a family in the future with climate activism?
That's a good question, because we are sort of on a tipping point, if you will. I'm 18, and my brother will be 17 this summer. So we're both getting into sort of adulthood and what comes next. And it feels very odd because it's both a big change and yet also doesn't feel all that different from what we've been doing since we have been so independent, especially in our learning styles, and yet so dependent at the same time. But we don't really know where we're going. We have just recently, well, I guess it's been a year ago, that moved to West Virginia and have been focused on, as a family, figure out what's next there. And there is a lot of change happening right now, both with how the Conservancy is thinking about managing the forest, but then we also have a traditional Chinese house being built on the property that came out of SCYM Friends, and just lots of programs are ramping up now, and people want to get out in nature, and balancing that. It's a property with 1,600 acres from the Shenandoah to the Appalachian Trail. So, but yeah, then the question is what's next and where are we going now? I've been highly involved in activism for so long, but you get to the point where you have to figure out, so how much of your life do you want this to basically be in control of, especially when you're working on these kind of huge existential issues. At some point, you've got to remember to live a little and still enjoy yourself and be happy, and not just be working constantly. And you're doing volunteer work that's entirely passion driven, the work-life balance gets even worse to some extent because a lot of it just is your life. That's what you do. And the question is, yeah, how much of that do you want? And I'm trying to figure that out now, and I guess I'm still asking a lot of these questions. I don't have a lot of answers, but we're working on it slowly, and it's been wonderful being out in the woods and with my animals. And I did just recently come back from Europe, so being there and getting to visit with many colleagues and friends that I've never had the chance to meet in person before. That's incredible, but to some extent that also opened up more questions of physically, where do you want to be? So I can't say I have a lot of answers for that, more of just a lot more questions. And we'll see where the light leads and where way opens. And I guess right now we're in a time of uncertainty, and I'm learning to sort of sit with that and live with that and see where it goes.
Right, and I'll add that as a family, I mean, this has been an incredible education experience for the kids, especially for Kallan and for us. And you know, you're in many ways suffering through the senior practical here, you know, having common common. Trying to provide less and less. Yeah. But, you know, support, you know, in many ways, and you know, it's, you know, we're at the time that there's going to have to be some nest leaving, and you know, everyone's going to be, you know, different. So, but given that, you know, we're open to, again, seeing what the city's boundary. But on the other hand, the activism now is ingrained on, we are, with Friends Wilderness Center, it is, I mean, the adjective that most people use, I mean, it is a wonderful place. There's not a lot of infrastructure there.
That's here.
Yeah. So it's fairly primitive, but people have been coming out there to meditate and heal for the last 50 years. And well, certainly what I have observed in climate activism is just the incredible burnout rate and the necessity to for self-care and how to use resources that already exist to be able to continue to work. And I'm hoping that where we're going will help to provide that kind of service. So that's where I see us going. Considering the current support of town.
Yeah, also just that being raised and taught in a sort of unconventional way, you don't have that like laid out path of how you're supposed to move through life. So I'm not sitting here with, mom and dad telling me, oh, you have to go to web because you're a legacy there, or even you have to go to college. So I feel like I'm dealing with that, like I cannot rule any option out. They're all open. The question is just where do you want to go?
I'm curious, you said you had comments about the youth climate change movement that you'd share.
Sure.
Yeah, I was curious what you want to share.
Yeah, mine, well, this might be, I don't know. One thing I was interested in is, I mean, we've heard about the support from your family and how a lot started there and how a lot also started within your own Quaker meeting, monthly meeting, and I guess, what, to some extent, your yearly meeting or your quarterly, yeah.
To some extent, that's
Yeah, and I'm wondering, is it, are you looking to maybe expand to get support from the wider Quaker community or other Quaker organizations already dealing with climate change, or how do you see yourself or the youth climate movement maybe interacting or getting support from some of those groups?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've worked with SCYM, I've worked with Shelley Tannenbaum at QEW, been to things like the Parliament of World Religions already, but it's hard to say. Again, the youth movement can be very resistant to the idea of organized religion. And I mean, that's obviously not something that I personally deal with this much because I grew up Quaker in an incredibly supportive meeting, and but I'm not entirely sure how to weave it in with the larger movement, especially because it can vary so much. I mean, most of my close friends that are actually peers are not on this continent. And so I've learned to kind of broaden my field of view when I'm looking for like-minded people who I want to work with, and those come from Quakers, those come from youth activists, and also just activists you kind of meet while working on it with various organizations on local, national, and international level. And tying that all together, I mean, that's honestly what I like to do, is connecting people and and saying, okay, let's not reinvent the wheel here. Let's work with these people over there. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes people want to reinvent the wheel because they've got other ideas of where it should go. And that can especially be prevalent in the youth movement because, you know, you get energized in high school and here's this big scary issue that seems like adults have kind of put on you. And it's hard to accept the wisdom of older activists or older organizations or churches or people who have already been involved because, but it's the issue's still here. And that's the case with climate change and social justice and all of the things we work on. So I would say it's kind of an ongoing thing and a constant balancing act of how do you connect those together? And where is the right place to connect them? I mean, I've certainly tried working with Quaker youth to get them involved as well, going the other way. And sometimes you have better success and sometimes you don't. So it depends a lot.
Yeah, I can see that there could also be a, I hear the balancing act you're speaking of, at the risk of the adults wanting to take over. So having this balance between trying to take the knowledge that adult activists might already have, but also letting, having the youth bring your perspective, your energies, your wanting a chance to do things.
Yeah, I mean, you have it from both sides. I do apologize. I'm not one for straightforward answers. But you know, you have it from both sides. You have the youth who sometimes are, you know, angry and upset for honestly justifiable reasons, who might not want to work with older activists. And then you have older activists that have been doing this for 40 or 50 years who, you know, have their way of doing it and new ideas or new viewpoints might not be very accepted. And sometimes it works great. You get them together and the light bulbs go off and it's okay. And here we go. And then other times it doesn't. I mean, in 2019, when we were planning the strikes in September, the youth got completely bulldozed and we ended up with 2 dates just because one of the organizations took it upon themselves to send out an op-ed. And of course, but again, you got it from the other side of you can't find a single date that works for the entire world. You're always going to have multiple dates. But at the same time, they shouldn't have done it that way. So it's a constant trade-off.
Kind of feeds into the question again.
Yeah,
Yes,
and that's,
exactly.
you know, so, yeah, I think my answer would very much lead into that, and, I mean, you know, what I've learned is, I mean, it's just not helpful really to compartmentalize youth. And, I mean, certainly, the first question is what's youth? I mean, it's very stratified, right? You've got.
Can I check for a second? The UN definition of youth is 35 and under.
No.
But no, it's 35, it's between 35 and 18. So anyone under 18 does not qualify as youth. But, and it's kind of wonky. I mean, I went to the UN Youth Summit and had to go through, well, first they accidentally signed me up to go to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Summit, which was not what I was working on. But we dealt with that, and eventually they're like, wait, you can't be here, you're 15. That's not. And I stood there arguing with the security guard. But on the other hand, you go to COP and it doesn't, they just don't think that anyone under 18 would possibly go there. So they have no protocols in place whatsoever. And you just go, you get your badge from the organization and go on in. It's
And what's COP stand for?
COP, so it's an entirely useless acronym. It stands for Conference of Parties. So it's Conference of Parties to blank agreement. So whether that be the Paris Agreement or the Montreal Protocol, there are multiple COPs within COP. And so this one was COP 26, and I forget what it might be Kyoto. Kyoto? Yeah. Okay. Which is the main one that they're going there for, but then there's other COPs within COP. But basically, it's the United Nations Climate Change Conference. It's run by the UNCCC.
Right, and so, I mean, the youth, I mean, you've got kids that are middle school age that just are always going to be there with their parents. And you've got high school kids who, of course, don't think the middle schoolers can hack it. And you've got, then, as soon as you get to college, it's like, it's very stratified and
It's kind of notorious for being segmented because, yes, the middle schoolers don't think the elementary schoolers should be involved and the high schoolers don't think the middle schoolers should be involved and so on and so forth.
So, and then you've got the whole thing of the UN doesn't even acknowledge anybody under 18. So defining what the youth movement is tough, and then what to, as I said before, there seems to be two major models for looking at the youth then, especially in climate and what to do. And one is basically what I've heard to say mouthpiece, in that you want Greta out there and you want to be able to tell her what to say, right?
Which, for the record, Greta is by no means willing to do, which has been a problem when working with many organizations.
I mean, yeah, but Greta has her issues, and what that allows Greta to do is stay focused, and she's not going to say where she wants to go, and that's what's made her be able to stay on point with all the stuff that goes on around her, which is an amazing quality. But yes, it does not allow, and that's what happened. I mean, I of course got to see this from the inside when she came to the United States. I mean, the environmental organizations here very much had a plan for what Greta was going to do and what she was going to say, and it did not happen. And they would very much like to create someone to fulfill that role, and there are plenty of candidates that would love to be that person, but it's tough, and in my view, it hasn't worked. On the other hand, how, if you're going to allow the youth to, self-organize and try to protect them from all the baggage that's gone before, how do you avoid 4 to 5, and how do you end up with a functional group? And it's tough, but the one thing that I think has been, if you're doing that, the youth in isolation do gravitate toward more of the Quaker bottom up type of organizing than wanting to have a mouthpiece that tells everybody what to do. And if you do the mouthpiece that tells everybody what to do, certainly, at least here in the United States, we know how to track that person down. You know, not, and that's not a youth thing, that's the way our society is. And, you know, if you ask someone to fulfill that goal without the support to be able to fend that off, you know, they're going to be eaten alive. And everybody who's done that has been. And so, you know, you can't do that to a, you know, if you've got a kid on every street corner, you know, with their Fridays for Future sign, you can't do that. So there's an advantage to that, but the disadvantage is you've got, you know, if you give everybody a voice, you're not speaking with one voice. And in many ways, you need a consistent voice at least. And that's, you know, what is a voice, especially when you're learning on the fly what the issues are, and, you know, what the history is. It's interesting to watch, and I have I'm experience with any of this. And it's both, I think it's fascinating, it's heartbreaking, and it's dispiriting to to see the infighting in the geopolitical world, in the who, why aren't you speaking with my voice in the environmental movement, and then overlaying the girls overlay onto that. It's tough.
And it was about halfway through working with Fridays for the Future that I realized that this is just Quaker process. The only issue is you're working with Quaker process, which with a bunch of people who have never experienced Quaker process before. So it's Quaker process being reinvented entirely organically with the various bumps that go along the way, as Quakers have certainly experienced. And that's very much framing this in the negative. But I mean, the way I see it is you kind of need a balance of all of this. I mean, you need all of these aspects to some extent to get the youth voice that is kind of, it has the moral high ground at this point, but then you also need the adult involvement to be mentorship and the knowledge, and you also need the groups of peers and the ability to be with other teenagers. But all of this has to be balanced and done in moderation. And if you go too far on any one side or any one issue, it's going to fall apart. But that trick is finding where that balance point is, and it's difficult. And the only way that you can kind of ensure this stability to some extent is by having an organization with paid staff and fundraising and the money behind that. But even those fall apart at times. Yes.
Well, I'm listening to you and what you're saying, and it's very true that and I've experienced it myself with seeing there are so many paths in the climate develop. There's the carbon capture way. There's the Extinction Rebellion pathway. There's and so you have these two here, which lobbying versus putting your body on the line, and it must be really challenging, especially as a young person, say, well, which one do I do? Which one's most effective? My life is on the line, whether I do it or don't, But I see that, so I'm trying to think about how would you get a single voice out there? Because I hear a voice that says, carbon capture, and you say this is going to do this and that, but where's the evidence? Do we really know you're speculating? And then, but then you have the other side that really is kind of dangerous, for a 15-year-old glue themselves to a doorway at the Wells Fargo, that type of thing.
Yeah, but the problem is that, we are trying to make one voice out of many, which you have in any movement, right? You have that in the climate movement, but you have that everywhere. And the problem is that no one voice is going to provide what we need. None of these solutions are going to fix the problems that we have on their own. It's that collective of everyone's voices, everyone's ideas, and that sort of collective vision that comes out of it that will be what actually gets us to make the change that we actually need. But the problem is then, what do you decide to work on? And knowing that there's not a single perfect solution or a perfect group to work with or a perfect way of doing it, how do you do that? Especially because sometimes they are mutually exclusive. I mean, when I was at COP and to some extent working on national legislation, you really can't be an activist and an advocate at the same time. I mean, you can do both at different times and with different hats, but trying to do them at the same time is incredibly difficult because, as an activist, you have to get all the way over here. But as an advocate, you have to be able to celebrate getting that tiny, tiny step that way, even if you've gone 2 steps back. Especially with international policy and with national policy as well. But yet at the same time, you can also do those at different times and be part of different movements, and I certainly have at different times in my life. But it's difficult, and again, I realize I'm not giving those straight answers, but the problem is there is no one answer. For every person, you've got to sit down and think about where is the right place for you. And that's another problem with when you're new to it, you just try the first thing that comes up. And sometimes that is not going to be the right place for you. And maybe it does become the right place down the line, but at that time, that just might not be what you're supposed to be doing right then. And it can be difficult, especially when it's all new to you, to kind of let go and realize, okay, I need to find somewhere else. And this is not what works for me or what I can add my skills to.
As we work on environmental issues, I would love to learn from you some of these scenarios that you're describing of people being taken down and people being asked to speak certain things, like the Greta being asked to say certain things that she would not say. Can you share so that we're able to detect that in our environments? If we see something going on, that we will be able to recognize it, because I understand the concept, but I don't know how to recognize it until it's probably too late. And I'm curious if you have examples of the people, how people have been taken down, or because I don't want somebody being, sacrificial lamb if it's not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, when you're in it, it becomes pretty obvious. But yeah, I mean, I think last time I was in a big blow up. I think the largest sign I ignored was when I got 20 messages from one person on Christmas Day, despite the fact that I had told everyone I would be off. And I guess that's the point where you realize that no, this can't function without me at this point. And that's a problem because it's not healthy for you. It's not healthy for anyone you're working on, whether you're relying on them or they're relying on you. That just does not work. Especially when you're working with a bunch of people and find that you kind of have to be the support system for all of that. And it's not sustainable in any way.
Yeah, and, we can give examples, and I can give you, examples that I won't give on camera too. But, for example, the picture you've got of Kallan, at least when I came to the yearly website here, is of Kallan at a rally when Greta was here. It was a press conference by Senator Markey when he was deciding that the way for him to, get his vote was to back climate change and speak with Greta. And, Greta was there, and Greta was like, no, this is US politics. I am not here to do politics. I am not getting up there and giving a speech. And so Kallan did talk at that press conference, and that's, you got the picture of her there doing that. And Greta was just like, no, that's not what I'm here for. Much to 350s. And she did go to some city hearings at the time. There were times where she was not going to speak at them, but she had her message, but she was not here to pick winners and losers in the US political system.
And she certainly provided the ability for other activists to speak. So I spoke a couple of times, but then you also have the games of, so who speaks? And you have both the problem of getting people whose voices aren't maybe able to be heard on regular contexts there, and if getting them matched with the opportunities, and yet also maybe not having the resources to get some of the people that should be there, especially as a youth movement, and especially when you're dealing with organizations that maybe don't want other people to speak, but really, really want the figurehead to speak.
Right. And the other thing is these things are not youth issues, for the most part. These are things we all recognize and you'll recognize them. The youth movement, the youth climate movement was at the time was primarily funded through the Women's March, just like March for Our Lives was.
Well, but it wasn't funded through the Women's March, it was funded through through March On, which was the women's marches.
Well, I'm sorry, right. The Women's March, and so the whole split there over, whether we're, between the Muslim and the Jewish influence of the Women's March, filters down to the youth, and how we're going to deal with Ramadan and all that kind of stuff is being forced. And that's what I would say to you. You got a very very good answer, but I don't think you got a typical youth answer or what's really going on with the youth from outset. I think what's not being said there is that, certainly from the youth, you've got the typical I'm invisible, Nazi. I don't think they're looking as much at the cost and consequences in the same way that Kallan is at this point, having experienced or what many of us would having experienced what we have. So that combined with the the expectation that so if you look at I've been thinking a little bit about the vocabulary, picking up the slogans, what we're, the substance of what we're talking about. So, we pick up immediately on all the current buzzwords on social change, how to make those arguments in the current vocabulary. being able to make the Twitter argument. Not surprisingly, the youth there are able to do this very well. But what we're not seeing is how do we put the process in place to accomplish it, right? And so that is what I think is lacking, and that's what Kallan talks about quicker process and looking at it. I mean, I've certainly heard all the splitting the hair on what the difference is between unity and consensus. But what I saw in the youth movement is, well, this is what we want to do, and not knowing what consensus is, but that's what they wanted to do, right? And trying to come up with a system, without that kind of guidance that was bottom up, that was, we're not going to be told what to do, or how do we do that? Well, we give everyone veto power, well, then how do we do anything? That sounds kind of familiar. Doesn't it? And that's very much what was going on when you were trying to give everyone a voice. Of course, that's not how you get 7 million people out on Twitter.
Yeah.
So, that was that.
But as you say, none of these issues are unique to the youth movement or the US movement. The biggest differences that I see, both being in the US and being in the youth, is that the US is huge. Organizing nationally here is not like organizing any other country nationally, not just because of our geographical size, but because of our population. And you can't even compare us with Canada, because we have just so much of everything: people, space, money, and trying to manage that is incredibly difficult. And one of the big parts of that is that we have a massive media market that has a voice around the world. So any organization or movement that comes into being, whether you're in the US or whether you're outside of the US, is competing to get into that US media market, and to have what they're working on be in the news and be in our news. And then specifically for the US youth, there is massive pressure for getting into college. Because again, our system is very different than a lot of other places. It's incredibly competitive, it's incredibly expensive, and getting into a good school is very important to people. So you see a lot of just trying to make the best resume that you possibly can, and that's not to say that they don't care about the issue. They care about the issue incredibly. But there is this immense pressure to still take care of yourself and to be able to be attractive to Harvard or Yale or Stanford, and that creates competition, which is why I think sometimes the US just has more of everything, and it's not that any of our problems are unique. It's just we have the ability to amplify it a lot of times.
We're coming to the end of time here, but I would add a few.
That was exactly what I was going to say. We have come to the end of our scheduled time. I don't have anything more to say than that. We've come to the end of our scheduled time. Whatever happens next is
Well, I
My
will say just
responsibility.
a couple of final comments on what I observed with the youth. You know, I probably shouldn't be talking about what, you know, the youth feel, but the dialogue that I've observed, I would say that, you know, one of the main things that happens is, you know, adults saying to, you know, well, you know, how are you going to solve the problem? And the youth aren't going to solve the problem. That's not
Tools.
yeah, that's exactly. And when they do, they'll want to be,
Yes.
or at least not challenge that. So, I mean, it's just not fair to ask the youth to solve the problem. And the other thing is, we just don't absolve ourselves by saying, okay, we're not supposed to use you, whatever. For grand scheme thing, that's not what we're doing. We need to collaborate. You don't, you know, you can't just say you decide what to do. We'll follow. We'll pay. That, you know, it's got to be collaborative. And that's, yeah, that may be, you know, given what I said about how the grades down. That's where not surprisingly where my conclusion comes down is that we're all in this together and they're working with the youth and collaborating is what we all.
Yeah, I would end with, well, I think one of my greatest strengths going in was that I was raised to treat adults equally. I mean, I did not grow up in the public school system, and I was homeschooled, and you know, I was with other kids of my age, but a lot of it was also spent with multi-generational groups, and I just wasn't afraid to talk to adults. And you know, I've gone into meetings with other youth, with adult organizations, and it's always fascinating to see the responses coming out, because you come out of a bad meeting where they're kind of being, you know, patronizing and talking down to you and telling you, well, this is what we're doing, and if you want to sign on, we'd really appreciate it, and maybe someone can go speak or something. And you know, I will come out of there. Like, what did you just do? No, I'm not working with you. And my friends will be kind of like, okay, but yeah. We didn't really get anywhere, but you know, okay, that's how it is. And meanwhile, we'll go to a decent meeting where we're having an exchange of ideas and being able to work on collaboration. And I come out there, you know, that's what I expected. This is how it should work. And my friends are like, wow, that was amazing. They listened to us. So I got a lot of, it was incredibly important to have that comfort with talking with multi-generational spaces. But I feel like we've been kind of negative, but all of these experiences have been overwhelmingly positive for the most part. And there have been difficulties and bumps along the road and conflict like you would have in any community or movement that you're looking at, and that you're a part of, because these are people. They're not robots, and despite what corporate America likes to think, you just can't take the humanity out of it. But I would not go back and change anything that we've done, or maybe a few minor tweaks where I think I've made a mistake, but it has been an overwhelmingly positive experience, and I'm very glad that I got to have that. Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
being here.
Thank you.